He spent years saying the FDA approved too much, too fast, on too little evidence. Then they put him in charge. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that one decision triggered a war with drug makers, rare disease families, politicians, and eventually the White House itself, and whether the man at the center of it was a principled watchdog or the regulator who slowed life-saving science when people were desperate for answers. The ending? He got pushed out, came back 12 days later, then left again. Nobody in FDA history has had a run quite like this. So sit back and let's get into it. Here's the thing about Vinay Prasad. Before he ever set foot inside the FDA, he'd already spent years telling anyone who'd listen exactly what was wrong with it. He's a hematologist-oncologist turned health policy critic, and his argument was consistent. The FDA was too willing to approve drugs on weak surrogate endpoints, lab values and tumor measurements that looked promising on paper but didn't always translate into patients living longer. He said COVID booster policy was too broad. He said oncology approvals rested on evidence that wouldn't hold up. The Associated Press, at the time of his appointment, called him a prominent critic of the pharmaceutical industry and the Food and Drug Administration. Then, on May 6, 2025, FDA Commissioner Marty Makary handed him the keys to the very center he'd been criticizing. Peter Marks had just resigned from that seat, the head of FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, warning on his way out that RFK Jr. wanted not truth but subservient confirmation of his misinformation and lies. The chair was empty. The atmosphere was already combustible. Prasad walked in. His first move was to redraw the line on COVID vaccines. In a framework he co-authored with Makary, Prasad wrote that the FDA would approve vaccines for high-risk persons and at the same time demand robust, gold-standard data on persons at low risk. On paper, that sounds almost obvious. Of course you want strong evidence. But then he overruled his own career staff, scientists who had been prepared to approve updated Moderna and Novavax COVID shots for everyone 12 and older, as in prior years. Prasad said no. In a 5-page internal memo, he wrote that even rare vaccine-related harms now have higher chance of outweighing potential benefits in low-risk populations. His critics pointed to the CDC's own figures. Since the prior fall, COVID had still caused between 32,000 and 51,000 American deaths, and more than 250,000 hospitalizations. His supporters said risk stratification was exactly right. Both sides had a case, and that tension was just the beginning. Because here's where it gets harder. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one of the cruelest disease arcs in pediatric medicine. Progressive, irreversible, and it almost exclusively affects boys. They lose the ability to walk in early adolescence. Cardiac and respiratory complications follow. For the roughly 15,000 Americans living with it, every regulatory clock is a countdown. So when a gene therapy called Elevidys, priced at $3.2 million per patient, came under scrutiny in the summer of 2025, the stakes were not abstract. In July, Sarepta paused all U.S. shipments after 2 teenage boys with Duchenne died of liver failure. Prasad's FDA announced it was investigating the death of an 8-year-old boy who had received the therapy. 3 days later, the agency said that child's death was unrelated to the drug. The hold for ambulatory patients was lifted. 3 days to investigate a child's death and clear a $3.2 million gene therapy. Whether that was appropriately rapid or dangerously fast, your narrator genuinely doesn't know. But the families watching that clock didn't feel the speed was the problem. Then Capricor Therapeutics arrived with a cell therapy for Duchenne-related heart complications. Their CEO, Linda Marban, had built her career around this product. When the FDA rejected it on July 11th, 6 weeks before their target review date, she said, "We thought we were a slam dunk." And then, For the first time in my life, we hired a lobbying firm. I got on an airplane and traipsed around Capitol Hill just to get our voices heard. A scientist who had run out of scientific options and reached for the only tools left. Pat Furlong, CEO of Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, a woman who buried both of her own sons to this disease, described families writing the FDA and copying their congressional representatives. Former Senator Rick Santorum, whose own daughter has a rare genetic disorder, went on X and said Prasad was destroying at POTUS' legacy for helping patients. Senator Ron Johnson said he relayed concerns directly to RFK Jr., Macari, and Trump himself. This was no longer a dispute about trial design. It was a siege. Prasad's answer, through it all, stayed the same. The FDA will not allow products whose harms are greater than benefits. Every word of that sentence is defensible, and every word of that sentence, to a parent whose son can't walk anymore, can feel like a door being locked from the inside. If you're finding this as complicated as I am, hit subscribe. I drop videos like this every week, and the final act of this story is the part that made my jaw drop. Alright, here's what I've been saving for you. In February 2026, Prasad refused to even review Moderna's application for an mRNA flu vaccine. The refusal letter, signed by him, said the trial design was inadequate because elderly patients in the control arm hadn't been given a high-dose comparator, which the FDA considered the gold standard. A senior FDA official described Moderna's trial as a brazen failure and, in another account, stone-cold negative. Moderna's CEO, Stéphane Bancel, responded that the decision did not identify any safety or efficacy concerns and does not further our shared goal of enhancing America's leadership in developing innovative medicines. 8 days later, the FDA reversed course and agreed to review the vaccine after all. 8 days. The line he drew, hard and public and humiliating for one of the world's largest vaccine makers, bent in a week. And then, before that dust had fully settled, it was announced he would leave the FDA for good at the end of April 2026. Let that sit for a second. He'd already been ousted once, pushed out at the end of July 2025, reportedly at White House direction, reportedly connected to social media attacks from political activist Laura Loomer. Macari called him a genius on the way out, which is what you say when you're eulogizing someone you just let go. Then, 12 days later, he was back. The administration apparently calculated that capitulating entirely to patient and industry pressure looked worse than keeping him, so they brought him back. And then, 8 months after returning, he left again anyway. The man who came in saying the evidence wasn't good enough couldn't hold his own position long enough to find out if he was right. So here's where we land. There are 3 real arguments you can make about Vinay Prasad, and they don't cancel each other out. He was consistent with his long-held views and willing to absorb enormous personal and political cost to defend them. He also introduced instability into the review process, repeatedly overruled staff, and generated reversals that fed the perception of chaos more than rigor. And he operated inside a political environment that put him in the job knowing exactly who he was, then pushed him out the moment the consequences arrived. Was he the watchdog or the obstacle? The most honest answer is, in a system that desperate for certainty, he was both. At the same time. And the system couldn't hold that. If this one made you think, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe. I've got something just as complicated coming next week.